The warden left her bleeding on the stone floor after she gave birth in chains, but an Apache warrior in the cell beside her broke every rule of survival to save them both. Fort Carson, Federal Prison, Colorado Territory, 1878. The fortress stood like a monument to human misery against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains, its walls built from granite blocks that had been quarried by the very prisoners they now contained. Inside those walls, justice wore the face of brutality, and mercy was a word spoken only in whispers. In the women's cell block, screams echoed through corridors that had heard too much suffering. Cell number 7 housed Beatrice B. Silva, barely 21 years old, her dark hair matted with sweat as labor pains tore through her body like lightning strikes. The iron shackles around her ankles had rubbed her skin raw, and the thin prison dress clung to her swollen form with each contraction that threatened to split her in half. Bee pressed her face against the cold stone wall, biting down on a strip of torn fabric to muffle her cries. The guards had made it clear that excessive noise would result in punishment, and she'd already endured enough beatings to know they weren't bluffing. Her hands gripped the rusted bars of her cell window, knuckles white with the effort of staying. Silent while her body fought to bring new life into this hellish place. 3 cells down, in the men's section separated by a thick stone wall, Dakota heard every muffled cry and felt his jaw clench with rage that had been building for 18 months. At 28, he possessed the lean, muscled frame of a warrior who had spent his youth hunting elk across the Colorado plains, and his manhood fighting a war that had already been lost. His Apache heritage showed in the sharp angles of his face, the way he moved with predatory grace even in chains, and the dark eyes that missed nothing in their constant assessment of threats and opportunities. The Apache warrior had learned the woman's story through whispered conversations passed between cells during the long nights when guards dozed at their posts. Beatriz Silva had been the wife of a Mexican ranch hand named Carlos, living a simple life on a spread outside Santa Fe until the night everything changed. A group of drunk soldiers had ridden onto their property, demanding food and shelter. When Carlos had tried to protect his pregnant wife from their advances, they'd shot him down like a dog and left him bleeding in the dirt. But the soldiers had made a mistake. In their drunken arrogance, they'd left behind a distinctive cavalry button, one that Bee had clutched in her hand as she'd crawled to her dying husband's side. When she'd taken that button to the territorial marshal, demanding justice for Carlos's murder, she'd learned a hard truth about the American frontier. The soldiers were the marshal's own men, and her testimony was not only unwelcome but dangerous. Within a week, Bee had found herself arrested on charges of horse theft, a crime that carried a mandatory 10-year sentence. The horse in question was her own mare, but the bill of sale had mysteriously disappeared from the territorial records. The trial had lasted exactly 40 minutes, with a judge who wouldn't meet her eyes and a jury of 12 men who'd already decided her fate before she'd spoken a word in her defense. Now 6 months later, she was giving birth in a cell that reeked of unwashed bodies and despair, with no midwife, no doctor, and no hope that her child would survive its first night in this place. The prison warden, a corpulent man named Augustus Blackthorne, had made it clear that pregnant prisoners were expensive inconveniences. If the baby died during birth, it would save the territory the cost of feeding another mouth. Dakota's own path to Fort Carson had been carved by a different kind of injustice, but the destination had been the same. He'd been a scout for the army, using his knowledge of Apache territories to help negotiate peace treaties between his people and the encroaching white settlements. For 3 years, he'd believed that cooperation might spare his tribe the fate that had befallen so many others across the Western Territories. That belief had died the night he discovered Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison selling weapons to Apache renegades. the same weapons that were being used to attack peaceful settlements and give the army justification for their brutal campaigns. When Dakota had confronted Morrison with evidence of his treachery, he'd found himself facing a choice between silence and death. He'd chosen a third option, stealing the weapons and returning them to the tribal elders who could dispose of them. Properly, Morrison's revenge had been swift and comprehensive. Within days, Dakota had been arrested for the theft of military property and the murder of 2 soldiers who had actually been killed by Morrison's own hand to cover his tracks. The trial had been a military tribunal where Apache testimony held no weight against the word of white officers, and the verdict had been predetermined before the first witness had been called. As another of B's muffled screams penetrated the stone wall between them, Dakota pressed his ear against the cold granite, listening to the rhythm of her breathing and the soft words of Spanish prayer that she whispered between contractions. He'd learned enough Spanish during his years as a scout to understand that she was praying not for herself, but for her unborn child, begging the Virgin Mary to let her baby live, even if she herself did not survive the night. The guard on duty was Sergeant Murphy, a man whose fondness for whiskey made him careless about his rounds after midnight. Dakota had been studying the man's patterns for weeks, noting how he dozed in his chair by the main door and how the keys on his belt jangled whenever he shifted position. Tonight, those observations might finally serve a purpose beyond mere survival. When B's next scream came louder than before, followed by the wet sound of something hitting the stone floor, Dakota knew the baby had been born. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any cry, and he strained his ears for some sound that would tell him both mother and child had survived the ordeal. Instead, he heard only B's ragged breathing and soft weeping, punctuated by urgent whispers in Spanish. "Por favor, respira, mi niño," she pleaded with her newborn, her voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "Please breathe, my child." Dakota closed his eyes and made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed during his months in this place. Prisoners who drew attention to themselves rarely lived to see their release dates, and helping another prisoner was considered a form of rebellion that was punished with solitary confinement or worse. But as he listened to B's desperate pleas for her child's life, he realized that some things were more important than survival. Moving with the silent grace that had made him legendary among both Apache and Army scouts, Dakota began working. On the loose stone he'd been carefully excavating from his cell wall for the past 3 months. It was slow, delicate work that had to be done without making any sound that might alert the sleeping guard. Each piece of mortar he scraped away brought him closer to the possibility of reaching the women's section, but it also increased the risk of discovery. The stone finally came free, leaving a gap barely wide enough for his arm to pass through. On the other side, he could see a sliver of the women's corridor, dimly lit by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the granite walls. More importantly, he could see the bottom edge of cell 7, where a small pool of blood reflected. "The lamplight, Senora," he whispered in Spanish, his voice barely audible through the gap. "Can you hear me?" The weeping stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of someone trying to muffle their breathing. After a long moment, B's voice came back, weak but alert with surprise and fear. "Who's there? Are you a guard?" "No, Senora. I'm a prisoner like you. My name is Dakota. I heard your baby being born. Is the child alive?" Another long silence, then a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "He won't breathe. He's so small and he won't breathe. I don't know what to do." Dakota had assisted with difficult births among his tribe, where every child was precious and the survival skills of the community often meant the difference between life and death. He knew that newborns sometimes needed help taking their first breath, and he knew the techniques that could make the difference. Listen to me carefully, Senora. Take the baby and hold him upside down by his feet. Then strike his back firmly with your palm, not hard enough to hurt him, but hard enough to clear his airways. Do this now. Through the gap in the wall, he heard the rustle of movement. Then, the sound of flesh striking flesh. Nothing happened for several heartbeats, and Dakota held his breath along with the desperate mother on the other side of the stone barrier. Then it came, a thin, reedy cry that was the most beautiful sound either of them had heard in months. The baby's voice grew stronger with each breath, and Bee's sob of relief echoed through both their cells. "He's breathing," she whispered, her voice thick with tears of joy. "Dios mío, he's breathing." "Good," Dakota replied, allowing himself. A moment of satisfaction before the reality of their situation reasserted itself. "But now you must listen to me again. The guards will have heard the crying. You need to keep the baby quiet, or they will come." "How?" "I have nothing to wrap him, and except this dress, and it's soaked with blood." Dakota looked around his own cell, taking inventory of everything he possessed. His threadbare blanket was rough wool that would chafe the baby's delicate skin, but it was clean and dry. Working quickly, he tore strips from the blanket and began feeding them through the gap in the wall. "Take these," he instructed. "Wrap the baby tightly, but leave his face uncovered so he can breathe. This will help keep him warm and muffle his cries." As Bee gratefully accepted the strips of cloth, Dakota continued to work on enlarging the gap in the wall. If they were going to survive the night, they would need to be able to communicate more easily. And if his escape plan had any chance of success, he would need to be able to pass larger items through the opening. "Why are you helping me?" Bee asked, as she wrapped her newborn son in the Apache warrior's blanket. "You don't know me. In this place, helping others only brings trouble." Dakota paused in his work, considering her question. The truth was complex, rooted in tribal customs about protecting women and children, shaped by his own sense of justice, and complicated by the growing respect he felt for this woman who had endured so much with such courage. But the simple answer was perhaps the most honest. "Because it's right," he said finally, "and because I've seen too much that was wrong to let it continue when I have the power to stop it." Outside their cells, Fort Carson Prison settled into the deep quiet of night. The guard towers were manned by soldiers who spent more time watching for Apache raids than monitoring the prisoners below, and the thick stone walls muffled most sounds from the outside world. It was in this enforced isolation that the most unlikely partnerships were sometimes born. "What's your name, Senora?" Dakota asked, as he continued to widen the gap between their cells. "Beatrice Silva," she replied, then added with a note of bitter humor, "though I suppose here I'm just prisoner number 47. "Not to me," Dakota said firmly. "And what will you call your son?" Bear looked down at the tiny face peering out from the rough wool wrapping, studying the features that reminded her so strongly of her murdered husband. The baby had Carlos's dark eyes and the same determined set to his jaw, even in sleep. "Miguel," she said softly, "after my father, who died fighting for Mexican independence. He always said that freedom was worth any sacrifice." "Miguel Silva," Dakota repeated, testing the name. "It's a good name for a fighter." As if responding to the discussion of his identity, baby Miguel chose that moment to let out a healthy cry that echoed through both cells. Bee quickly brought him to her breast, hoping to quiet him before the guards noticed, but the damage was already done. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor, accompanied by the jangle of keys and the cursing of men who'd been awakened from comfortable sleep. "Shut that thing up!" bellowed Sergeant Murphy as he approached the women's section, his breath reeking of whiskey and his uniform disheveled from his nap. I won't have crying babies disturbing the peace of this facility. Please, Sergeant, Bee pleaded through her cell door. He's just hungry. I can keep him quiet. Murphy peered through the bars at her, his bloodshot eyes taking in the scene of recent childbirth with disgust rather than compassion. Blood stained the stone floor, and Bee's prison dress was torn and soiled from her ordeal. The baby in her arms continued to fuss despite her attempts to soothe him. Warden Blackthorne left specific instructions about prisoners giving birth, Murphy said, with the tone of a man who enjoyed delivering bad news. Babies born in this facility are the responsibility of the territory, which means they go to the orphanage in Denver. Mothers who can't work due to childbirth get reduced rations until they're back on their feet. You can't take my baby, Bee said, her voice rising. With panic, he needs me. He needs to nurse. What he needs is to be raised by decent people, not criminals, Murphy replied, reaching for his keys. I'll be back in the morning with a wagon from the orphanage. Until then, keep that thing quiet, or I'll move it to the isolation cells where the crying won't bother anyone. As Murphy's footsteps retreated, Bee collapsed against the back wall of her cell, clutching Miguel against her chest, while tears streamed down her cheeks. She'd known this moment would come, but knowing hadn't made it any easier to face. In the morning, they would take her son away forever, and she would never see him again. Through the gap in the wall, Dakota's voice came soft but determined. That's not going to happen, Beatrice Silva. I give you my word, as an Apache warrior, they will not take your son. How can you stop them? She whispered back. We're prisoners. We have no power here. We have more power than they think, Dakota replied, and in his voice was a note of steel that made her look toward the gap with new hope. And sometimes, the best time to escape a trap is when your captors think you're helpless. As the hours of night ticked by, Dakota began to outline a plan that was both audacious and dangerous. A plan that would require perfect timing, absolute trust, and a willingness to risk everything for the chance at freedom. In the darkness of their cells, two prisoners who had been strangers hours before began to forge a partnership that would challenge every assumption their captors had made about the powerlessness of the condemned. Dawn crept through the barred windows of Fort Carson Prison like a reluctant witness, casting pale shadows across the stone corridors where hope had been systematically murdered for nearly a decade. The morning bell clanged with metallic brutality, signaling the beginning of another day in hell. But for Beatrice Silva, it marked the countdown to losing her son forever. In cell 7, Bear sat propped against the cold wall, her newborn Miguel, nestled against her chest beneath the Apache blanket strips that Dakota had passed through their makeshift connection. The baby had nursed through the night, his tiny fists gripping her finger with a strength that belied his fragile appearance. Every moment she held him felt both precious and stolen, knowing that Sergeant Murphy would return with the orphanage wagon as promised. Through the gap in the stone wall, Dakota's voice came as a whisper that somehow carried more authority than the shouted commands of the guards. The shift change happens at 7 o'clock, he said, his words careful and precise. Murphy will be replaced by Corporal Jenkins, who's half-blind and twice as lazy. That's when we move. Move where? Bea asked, adjusting Miguel's position as he made soft, sleeping sounds that tugged at her heart. This isn't some territorial jail with wooden bars. These walls are 3 feet thick, and the guards carry rifles. I've been studying this place for 18 months, Dakota replied, and there was something in his tone that made her lean closer to the gap. Every wall has a weakness. Every routine has a flaw. The question isn't whether we can escape, it's whether you're brave enough to try. Before Bee could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the corridor, accompanied by voices that carried the casual cruelty of men who viewed prisoners as livestock. Warden Augustus Blackthorne had arrived for his morning inspection, flanked by 2 guards whose job was less about security and more about intimidation. Blackthorn was a mountain of a man, standing nearly 6.5 feet tall with shoulders that had been broadened by years of manual labor before he'd climbed the political ladder to his current position. His grey beard was meticulously trimmed, and his uniform bore creases sharp enough to cut paper, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who measured human worth in dollars and cents. "Prisoner 47, he announced as he stopped. Outside B's cell, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "I trust you understand the situation regarding your offspring." B struggled to her feet, keeping Miguel protectively clutched against her chest. The movement sent sharp pains through her body, reminders of the difficult birth she'd endured without medical assistance, but she forced herself to stand straight and meet the warden's gaze without flinching. "His name is Miguel," she said quietly, "and he's my son, not my offspring." Blackthorn's laugh was like the sound of grinding stone. "Your son is property of the Colorado Territory, same as you. The law is quite clear on this matter. Children born to incarcerated felons become wards of the state. It's actually a mercy, preventing them from following their parents' criminal path." "I'm not a criminal," B said, her voice gaining strength despite the hopelessness of her situation. "I was framed for a crime I didn't commit, and you know it." "What I know," Blackthorn replied, stepping closer to the bars, "is that you were convicted by a jury of your peers and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. Your personal delusions about innocence are irrelevant to the administration of justice." Inside the adjacent men's section, Dakota pressed his ear against the gap in the wall, listening to every word while his hands worked methodically to enlarge the opening. The conversation confirmed what he'd suspected about Blackthorn. The man was intelligent, ruthless, and completely without conscience. Escaping would require more than just physical prowess. It would demand psychological warfare. "The wagon from the Denver orphanage will arrive at noon," Blackthorn continued, consulting a pocket watch with theatrical precision. "I suggest you use the remaining hours to make peace with this decision. Fighting the inevitable only causes unnecessary suffering." "And what about her medical condition?" Dakota's voice suddenly rang out from the men's section, startling everyone in the corridor. "Territorial law requires that women receive proper medical care after childbirth. She needs a doctor, not a lecture." Blackthorn's head snapped toward the source of the voice, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and anger. "Prisoner 63, you're speaking out of turn. Additional comments will result in a week in solitary confinement." "Then let me make them count," Dakota replied, his tone remaining calm and respectful despite the threat. Article 7 of the Territorial Prison Code states that medical emergencies take precedence over administrative procedures. If this woman dies from complications of childbirth while in state custody, you'll answer to the territorial governor himself. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Blackthorn was clearly taken aback by Dakota's knowledge of prison regulations, and his guards shifted uncomfortably as they realized they might be witnessing a legal challenge to their authority. "How does an Apache savage know territorial law?" Blackthorn asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The same way a warden learns to read prisoner files," Dakota answered. "Carefully and with attention to detail. I notice you haven't called for a doctor yet." B watched this exchange with growing amazement. Dakota was playing a dangerous game, using Blackthorn's own legal responsibilities against him while simultaneously provoking the man's temper. It was either brilliant strategy or calculated suicide, and she couldn't tell which. Blackthorn stood in the corridor for nearly a full minute, his massive frame trembling with suppressed rage while he calculated the political ramifications of ignoring Dakota's challenge. Finally, he turned to one of his guards with the expression that promised future retribution. "Send word to Dr. Mackenzie in town. Tell him we need a medical consultation for a female prisoner who gave birth last night, and make sure he understands that this is a routine examination, nothing more." "Yes, sir," the guard replied, clearly relieved to have a reason to leave. The increasingly tense situation. As the footsteps faded, Blackthorn turned back to B's cell with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "You have until the doctor finishes his examination, prisoner 47. After that, the child goes to Denver regardless of your medical status. Use the time wisely." When the warden and his remaining guard had departed, B sank back down onto the stone floor, her legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Miguel stirred in her arms, making the soft mewing sounds that newborns use to communicate their needs, and she automatically began to rock him gently. "Why did you do that?" she asked through the gap in the wall. "You just bought us a few hours at most, and now Blackthorn will be watching you even more closely." "Because a few hours might be enough," Dakota replied, and she could hear the sound of stone scraping against stone as he continued to work on their connection. "And because Dr. Mackenzie isn't just the town physician, he's also the territorial medical examiner, which means he has authority that even Blackthorn can't ignore." "You know him?" "I know his reputation. James Mackenzie is one of the few honest men left in this territory, and he has a particular hatred for officials who abuse their authority. If we can get him alone with you for a few minutes, we might have a chance to send a message to the outside world." B felt a flicker of hope for the first time since Miguel's birth. "What kind of message?" "The kind that might save all three of our lives," Dakota said, and there was something in his voice that made her believe he'd been planning this moment for far longer than just one night. "But first, I need to tell you something about why I'm really here." Over the next hour, as the morning sun climbed higher and the sounds of prison routine echoed through the corridors, Dakota revealed the true story of his imprisonment. The weapons theft had been real, but it had been part of a larger plan to expose corruption that reached from frontier army posts all the way to territorial headquarters in Denver. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison wasn't just selling weapons to Apache renegades, Dakota explained, his voice heavy with the weight of betrayal. He was orchestrating raids on peaceful settlements, then using the violence to justify military contracts that made him rich. I had documented proof of 12 separate incidents where innocent families died for Morrison's profit. "What happened to the proof?" B asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Destroyed in a convenient fire the night before my trial," Dakota replied bitterly, along with the testimony of 3 other soldiers who were willing to speak against Morrison. They died in the same fire, officially ruled an accident caused by a faulty chimney. The implications of what he was telling her began to sink in. Dakota wasn't just another prisoner caught in the machinery of frontier justice. He was a witness to systematic corruption whose testimony could bring down powerful men. His continued existence was a threat that someone was clearly willing to kill, to eliminate. "If that's true," B said slowly, "then they never intend to let you live long enough to serve your full sentence." "Exactly. Which is why we need to get out of here before they find a way to arrange a convenient accident, and why you and Miguel are coming with us, because I won't leave a woman and child in the hands of men like Blackthorn." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation, but these were different from the heavy boots of guards or the measured pace of the warden. These steps belonged to someone who walked with the confidence of civilian authority, and they were accompanied by the rattling of medical equipment. Dr. James Mackenzie appeared in the corridor like an answer to prayer, his grey hair disheveled from the morning ride and his black medical bag clutched in one weathered hand. At 62, he'd been practicing frontier medicine for more than 3 decades, and his face bore the lines of a man who'd seen too much suffering and too little justice. "Where's the patient?" he asked brusquely, addressing the guard who'd escorted him into the prison. "And why wasn't I called immediately after the birth? Postpartum complications can be fatal if left untreated." Warden's orders, sir, the guard replied nervously. He said it was just a routine examination. Mackenzie's eyes flashed with anger. There's nothing routine about childbirth in a prison cell, Corporal. Open that door and give me some privacy. With my patient. Medical examinations don't require an audience. As the guard fumbled with his keys, Dakota made his move. Using a piece of broken stone, he tapped against the wall in a pattern that Mackenzie would recognize. 3 short taps. 3 long, 3 short. Morse code for SOS, a signal that military doctors had been taught to watch for in situations where patients couldn't speak freely. Mackenzie's head turned sharply toward the sound, his experienced eyes taking in the gap between the cells and understanding immediately that something more than routine medical care was needed here. When the guard opened B's cell door, the doctor stepped inside and closed it firmly behind him. "Corporal," he said, with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "I need hot water, clean towels, and privacy for at least 30 minutes. This examination cannot be rushed, and interruptions could endanger both mother and child." When they were alone, Mackenzie knelt beside B and began his examination with gentle, professional hands. But as he worked, he spoke in a voice low enough that only she could hear. "I heard the SOS signal from the next cell," he said quietly. "What's really happening here?" B looked into his kind eyes and made a decision that would change everything. In whispered words, she told him about Carlos's murder, the frame-up that had brought her to prison, and the plan to take Miguel away that very day. She spoke of Dakota's help through the night and his own story of corruption and betrayal. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." When she finished, Mackenzie sat back on his heels with an expression of grim determination. "I've suspected Blackthorne of irregularities for months," he said. "Missing prisoners, unexplained deaths, medical care denied for political reasons. But I've never had proof solid enough to take to the territorial authorities." "What can you do?" B asked, hope and desperation warring in her voice. Mackenzie reached into his medical bag and withdrew a piece of paper and a pencil. "I can write a medical order that will keep you and your son here for at least 48 hours, while you recover from complications of childbirth. And I can carry a message to someone who has the power to investigate what's really happening in this place." "Who?" "Judge Samuel Harrison, the territorial circuit judge. He's due in town tomorrow for the quarterly court session, and he's one of the few officials in this territory who can't be bought or intimidated. If he gets solid evidence of corruption, he'll act on it." As Mackenzie wrote his medical order with careful precision, Dakota's voice came through the gap in the wall one more time. "Doctor, there are 17 other prisoners in this facility who were convicted on questionable evidence or whose sentences have been illegally extended. Their names and cell numbers are carved into the stone above my bunk. Someone needs to know." Mackenzie nodded grimly. "I'll make sure Judge Harrison gets a complete report. But you need to understand, if what you're telling me is true, then everyone involved in exposing this corruption is in mortal danger. Blackthorne and his allies won't hesitate to kill to protect themselves." "Then we'd better make sure we get them before they get us," Dakota replied, and in his voice was the steel of a warrior preparing for battle. As Dr. Mackenzie prepared to leave, he handed B a small vial of medicine, along with specific instructions for caring for Miguel. But hidden beneath the medical supplies was something else, a small knife sharp enough to cut bonds and a hand-drawn map showing the location of a safe house in the mountains where territorial marshals had hidden witnesses. "In the past 48 hours, he whispered as he packed his bag. "Whatever you're planning, you have 48 hours before I can't protect you anymore." When the doctor departed, leaving behind his medical order and the promise of hope, B and Dakota found themselves facing a deadline that seemed both generous and impossibly short. 2 days to expose corruption that had been years in the making, escape from a fortress designed to be impregnable, and stay alive long enough to see justice done. But as evening shadows began to lengthen across the prison yard, and as Miguel slept peacefully in his mother's arms, wrapped in an Apache warrior's blanket, both prisoners began to believe that freedom might be more than just a dream. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and greater dangers, but tonight they had hope. The second night in Fort Carson prison descended like a shroud over the mountain fortress, bringing with it secrets that would reshape the lives of everyone within its walls. In the warden's office, lit by the dancing flames of oil lamps that cast ominous shadows across ledgers filled with damning entries, Augustus Blackthorne sat across from a visitor whose presence in the prison was both unexpected and deeply troubling. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison had arrived under cover of darkness, his military uniform replaced by civilian clothes that couldn't disguise the predatory bearing of a man accustomed to wielding life-and-death authority. At 45, Morrison possessed the lean build of a career soldier, but his pale eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had long ago abandoned honor in favor of profit and survival. "Dr. Mackenzie's visit today was unfortunate," Morrison said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of military training. "His medical order gives the woman 48 hours of protection, during which time she could say anything to anyone who visits the prison." Blackthorne poured whiskey into 2 glasses, his massive hands steady despite the gravity of their conversation. "She doesn't know anything that could hurt us. She's just a Mexican woman who killed her husband and happened to give birth in my prison." "She's not just any woman," Morrison replied, accepting the drink but not touching it to his lips. "Her husband, Carlos Silva, was one of my scouts before his death. He knew about the weapons shipments, the staged raids, everything. If he told her anything before he died, she could corroborate Dakota's story. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre." Blackthorne's confident expression faltered as he realized the true scope of the threat they faced. Carlos Silva hadn't been a random ranch hand. He'd been an insider who could have exposed the entire operation. How much did he know? Blackthorne asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Enough to destroy us all," Morrison replied. Carlos was getting suspicious about the timing of Apache raids, asking questions about why certain settlements were always left undefended. "I had to eliminate him before he could piece together the full picture. So you had him killed and framed his pregnant wife for the murder. That's elegant, even for you." Morrison's smile was razor-thin. "It would have been perfect if Dakota hadn't survived long enough to be captured. That Apache bastard has been gathering evidence for months, and now he's in contact with the woman whose husband we killed. They're 2 pieces of a puzzle that could hang us all." In the cells below, unaware of the deadly conversation taking place above their heads, Bee and Dakota were putting the final touches on their own plans. The gap between their cells had been widened enough to pass small objects back and forth, and they'd spent the day creating tools and weapons from the most mundane materials. Dakota had fashioned a rope from strips of his blanket, twisted and braided with the skill of someone who had learned Apache hunting techniques from childhood. The rope was thin but strong, capable of supporting a man's weight during a climb, or serving as a weapon in close combat. Hidden within the braiding were small pieces of sharpened stone that could cut through leather or fabric. The guard rotation. "Changes at midnight," he whispered through their connection, his voice barely audible above the sound of wind howling through the prison's stone corridors. "Jenkins will be replaced by Patterson, who's lazy but not stupid. We'll have a 15-minute window when the corridor is unwatched." Bee adjusted Miguel's position against her chest, marveling at how quickly she'd learned to move silently even while holding a newborn. The baby seemed to sense the tension in his mother's body and had remained remarkably quiet throughout the day. as if he understood that their survival depended on stealth. "What about the outer walls?" she asked. "Even if we get out of the cells, we still have to cross the yard and climb a 20-foot stone barrier." "I've been watching the patrol patterns for 18 months, Dakota replied. "There's a blind spot near the northeastern corner, where the guard towers can't see the base of the wall. The stones there are older, more weathered, with enough handholds for someone who knows how to climb." "Someone who knows how to climb," Bay repeated. "I've never climbed anything higher than a fence, and I'll be carrying Miguel." "Then you'll learn tonight, or we'll all die trying, because staying here means certain death, just spread out over a longer timeline." The grim truth of his words settled over them both. They'd crossed a line by accepting Dr. Mackenzie's help and making plans to expose the corruption. Blackthorn and his allies would never allow them to live long enough to testify, which meant their only chance lay in escape and reaching Judge Harrison before their enemies could silence them permanently. Above them, Morrison was outlining a plan that would eliminate both prisoners and make their deaths appear accidental. A gas explosion in the cell block, perhaps, or a fire that would consume evidence along with witnesses. Blackthorn listened with the attention of a businessman. "Reviewing a profitable contract. The timing has to be perfect," Morrison explained. "Too soon, and Mackenzie's medical order will raise questions. Too late, and Harrison arrives for the court session. We need them dead within 24 hours, and we need it to look like natural disaster." "What about the other prisoners?" Blackthorn asked. 17 men died in a gas explosion might attract unwanted attention." "Acceptable losses," Morrison replied coldly. "Most of them are political prisoners or witnesses to our other operations anyway. Cleaning house will actually strengthen our position in the long run." The casual discussion of mass murder revealed the true scope of the corruption that had infected the territorial justice system. These weren't desperate men making desperate choices. They were calculating predators who had turned the mechanisms of law and order into tools for personal enrichment and power. Meanwhile, in the depths of the prison, Dakota was sharing knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for their escape attempt. His years as an army scout had taught him to read the land, the weather, and the behavioral patterns of both animals and men. All of these skills would be crucial once they were outside the prison walls. "The mountain trails are treacherous in winter," he explained, sketching a rough map on the stone floor with a piece of charcoal. "But there are Apache caches hidden throughout these peaks. Food, weapons, blankets stored against hard times. If we can reach the first cache, we'll have supplies to last until we can get to Dr. Mackenzie's safe house." "How far to the first cache?" B asked, studying the primitive map by the faint light filtering through their cell window. 8 miles through terrain that would challenge an experienced mountaineer in good weather. With snow and a newborn, it becomes nearly impossible. B felt her heart sink, but Dakota continued before despair could take hold. Nearly impossible, but not completely impossible. Apache women have given birth on war trails and kept moving because the alternative was death for the entire band. "You're stronger than you think, Beatrice Silva, and Miguel is stronger than he looks." The baby stirred at the sound of his name, his tiny fist emerging from the blanket wrapping to wave in the air like a flag of defiance. B smiled, despite their desperate circumstances, seeing in her son the same determination that had carried her through months of imprisonment and the agony of solitary childbirth. "Tell me about the caches," she said. "What will we find there?" Dakota's voice took on the cadence of oral tradition as he described the ancient Apache practice of preparing for survival in hostile territory. The caches were more than just supply depots. They were symbols of a people's refusal to surrender to forces that sought to destroy them. Each cache contains enough dried meat and water to sustain a small group for several days, he explained. There are also weapons, knives, arrows, sometimes rifles taken from fallen enemies. Most importantly, there are blankets and clothing suitable for mountain weather. And if the caches have been discovered, if soldiers or settlers have found them, then we improvise, adapt, and overcome. It's what my people have been doing for generations against enemies who outnumber us 1,000 to 1. As midnight approached, the prison settled into the deepest quiet of the night cycle. This was when the building itself seemed to sleep, when the weight of stone and iron relaxed just enough to allow hope to slip through the cracks. It was also when the most dangerous predators began to move. The sound of footsteps in the corridor was different from the usual guard patrol, softer, more purposeful, belonging to someone who didn't want to be heard. Dakota pressed his ear to the gap between cells, his warrior instincts screaming that danger was approaching from an unexpected direction. "Someone's coming," he whispered urgently. "Not guards. Someone trying to move silently." Bay clutched Miguel closer, her heart racing as she tried to identify the approaching threat. The footsteps stopped directly outside her cell, followed by the soft scraping of metal against metal as someone worked with the lock mechanism. The cell door swung open to reveal a figure she'd never seen before. A young woman, perhaps 25 years old, with the lean build of someone accustomed to physical labor and eyes that held depths of knowledge far beyond her apparent age. She wore the simple dress of a prison worker, but her movements carried the fluid grace of someone trained in combat. "My name is Sarah Running Bear," the woman said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Dakota's sister, and I've come to get you out of here." The revelation struck like lightning, reshaping everything Bee thought she knew about their situation. Dakota had a sister who was somehow inside the prison, which meant their escape. Attempt had resources and allies they hadn't dared to hope for. "Sarah?" Dakota's voice came through the gap in the wall, filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "How did you get inside? It's too dangerous for you to be here." "Danger is a luxury we can't afford anymore," Sarah replied, moving with practiced efficiency to unlock Dakota's cell. "Morrison arrived 3 hours ago. They're planning to kill everyone in this cell block tomorrow night and make it look like an accident." "How do you know this?" Bee asked, still struggling to process the sudden change in their circumstances. Sarah's smile was grim as winter wind. "Because I've been working in the warden's kitchen for 6 months, listening to conversations and waiting for the right moment to act. Morrison drinks too much and talks too freely when he thinks only Blackthorn can hear him." As Dakota emerged from his cell for the first time in 18 months, Bee was struck by the sheer physical presence of the man who had become her unlikely ally. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with the lean muscle and graceful movement of a natural predator, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, dark as night sky and holding depths of intelligence that explained how he'd survived so long in this place. "We need to move now," Sarah continued, producing a bundle of clothing from beneath her dress. "I've been mapping guard positions and patrol schedules for months. There's a 20-minute window starting in 5 minutes when the outer wall is completely unwatched." "What about Miguel?" Bea asked, looking down at her sleeping son. "He's only 2 days old. The cold could kill him." Sarah's expression softened as she looked at the newborn. Apache children are born into harsh worlds and learn to survive from their first breath. "Your son has warrior blood from both parents, Mexican, and whatever strength brought you through this trial. He'll survive because he must." Dakota was already changing into the civilian clothes his sister had brought, his movements economical and purposeful. The transformation from prisoner to free man seemed to happen before Bee's eyes, as if the simple act of removing shackles had restored his natural authority. "The plan has changed," he said, checking the crude weapons they'd fashioned over the past 2 days. "Sarah's intelligence about Morrison means we can't wait for Dr. Mackenzie's timeline. We leave tonight, or we die tomorrow." "Where will we go?" B asked, wrapping Miguel in the warmest layers they could provide. "If Morrison has resources inside the prison, he'll have people watching the roads and settlements." "We go where white men fear to follow," Sarah replied. "Into the deep mountains, to the sacred places where our grandfathers' spirits still guard against enemies." As they prepared to leave the cells that had been their prison for months, each carrying nothing but hope and determination, none of them could know that their escape would trigger a manhunt that would span 3 territories and involve forces that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. They knew only that freedom lay somewhere beyond the stone walls, and that they would find it together or die in the attempt. The first phase of their escape began with Sarah leading them through corridors she'd memorized during months of careful observation. Every shadow held potential discovery. Every sound could bring armed guards, but they moved with the fluid coordination of people who trusted each other completely. As they reached the final corridor before the outer door, Sarah stopped and turned to face both Dakota and B with an expression of grim determination. "Beyond this point, there's no turning back," she said quietly. "Once we leave this building, we become hunted animals. Everyone we meet could be an enemy. Every town could be a trap. Are you prepared for that life?" Bea looked down at Miguel, sleeping peacefully in his blanket wrapping, then at Dakota, whose eyes reflected the same determination she felt burning in her own chest. "I've been hunted since the day my husband was murdered," she replied. "At least now I'll be hunted while fighting back." The outer door of Fort Carson prison swung open on silent hinges, revealing a world transformed by winter's brutal embrace. Snow fell in thick curtains across the mountain landscape, each flake carrying the promise of death for those unprepared to face the Colorado wilderness. The temperature had plummeted to levels that could freeze exposed flesh within minutes, and the wind howled through the peaks like the voices of vengeful spirits. The 3 fugitives, Dakota, B clutching baby Miguel, and Sarah running bare, stepped into freedom that felt more like stepping into the jaws of a frozen hell. The contrast between the relative warmth of their stone cells and the savage cold of the mountain night was so extreme that B gasped involuntarily, her breath forming a cloud of vapor that dissipated instantly in the driving wind. Sarah led them across the prison yard with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed, her feet finding paths through the snow that left barely any trace of their passage. She'd spent months studying the guard patterns from her position in the prison kitchen, noting how the tower sentries grew careless during blizzards when visibility dropped to mere yards and their attention focused more on staying warm than watching. "For escapees, the wall is 200 feet ahead," she whispered, her breath forming crystals in the bitter air that clung to her dark hair like diamonds. "Once we start climbing, we can't stop until we're over. The guards change positions in 12 minutes, and the dogs will pick up our scent if we linger." Dakota moved beside his sister with the predatory grace of a wolf, returning to its natural habitat, his Apache training allowing him to navigate the treacherous terrain despite 18 months of confinement that had weakened his body but never broken his spirit. His eyes remained constantly alert, scanning for threats that could emerge from the swirling snow at any moment, while his ears strained for sounds that might indicate discovery. Bee struggled more than the others, her body still recovering from the trauma of childbirth, and her feet unaccustomed to the harsh mountain environment that could kill the unprepared in dozens of different ways. Miguel remained mercifully quiet against her chest, wrapped in layers that Sarah had procured along with their civilian clothes. But she could feel the cold seeping through even the warmest coverings like ice water through her veins. The journey across the yard seemed to take hours rather than minutes, each step a calculated risk that could trigger the alarm and bring armed guards pouring out of the guard towers. The snow beneath their feet crunched with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the winter silence, and more than once they froze completely when shadows moved in the watchtowers above. The prison wall loomed before them like a monument to human cruelty, its granite blocks slick with ice that had formed from centuries of mountain weather, and crowned with iron spikes designed to discourage exactly the kind of escape they were attempting. The barrier stood 25 feet high, constructed by prisoners whose bones now lay in unmarked graves around the fortress perimeter. Sarah produced a coiled rope from beneath her coat, revealing preparations that had taken weeks of careful planning and considerable risk to acquire. The rope was military grade, stolen from the prison's own supply depot during one of her kitchen duties, and it would either carry them to freedom or become the instrument of their capture. "The rope goes around that outcropping 20 feet up," she explained in a whisper barely audible above the wind, pointing to a section where the wall's construction had left a natural anchor point, created by the mountain's original rock formation. "Dakota goes first to secure the line, then helps pull you and the baby up from above while I cover our tracks in the snow." But as Dakota prepared to begin the climb, flexing fingers that had grown stiff during months of imprisonment, the sound of barking dogs echoed across the prison yard like the baying of hellhounds. The sound was followed by shouted commands that sent ice through their veins and confirmed their worst fears. Someone had discovered their escape far sooner than expected, and the hunt was already beginning. "They know we're gone," Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm of someone who had prepared for this possibility and accepted its deadly implications. "The night guard must have made an early check, or someone heard us moving through the corridors." Through the falling snow came the wavering light of torches and lanterns as armed men poured out of the prison buildings like ants from a disturbed nest. At their head strode Warden Blackthorne himself, his massive frame unmistakable even in the blizzard, flanked by Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and a dozen guards carrying rifles that gleamed dully in the torchlight. "Find them!" Blackthorne's voice boomed across the yard with the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "They can't have gotten far in this weather. Shoot to kill. We can't afford witnesses to what they've seen and heard." The order to shoot on sight confirmed what they'd all suspected but hoped wasn't true. This was no longer about recapturing escaped prisoners who could be returned to their cells for additional punishment. This was about eliminating threats to a conspiracy that reached from frontier army posts to the highest levels of territorial government, where men in fine suits made decisions that left bodies scattered across the American West. Dakota scaled the wall with inhuman speed that spoke of childhood spent in terrain that would challenge mountain goats, his fingers finding purchase on stones that seemed impossible to grip, and his muscles remembering skills that 18 months of imprisonment couldn't erase. The rope uncoiled behind him as he climbed, snaking through the darkness like a lifeline to salvation. The granite blocks were treacherous with ice that had formed and reformed through countless freeze-thaw cycles, creating a surface that could send even an experienced climber plummeting to their death. But Dakota moved with the confidence of someone who had scaled cliff faces to reach eagle nests as a boy, who had learned to trust his body's balance and his fingers' strength when failure meant death. Within moments, he'd reached the top and secured their lifeline around the iron spikes that were meant to keep prisoners inside, but now served as anchors for their escape. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The very instruments of their oppression had become the tools of their liberation. "Now!" he called down, his voice barely audible above the wind that threatened to tear the words away before they could reach his companions below. Sarah went up the rope with the fluid efficiency of someone who had practiced this exact maneuver dozens of times in preparation, her movements economical and precise despite the urgency of their situation. Her climb took less than a minute, her muscles working with mechanical precision, while her mind remained focused on the sounds of pursuit growing closer with each passing second. But as Bee approached the wall with Miguel clutched against her chest, the dog's barking grew closer, and she could see the wavering torchlight approaching through the snow like malevolent stars in the darkness. The search party was spreading out in a systematic pattern that would eventually cover every inch of the prison yard, and their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The climb became a nightmare that tested every ounce of strength and determination she possessed. The rope, slick with ice and snow, seemed determined to slip through her fingers despite her desperate grip. Her body, weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and recent childbirth, protested every movement with sharp pains that threatened to overwhelm her concentration. Miguel's weight against her chest created an additional challenge that she hadn't anticipated. His small body threw off her balance and made it impossible to use both hands effectively on the rope. She found herself climbing one-handed while using the other arm to secure her son against her body, a technique that would have been difficult under ideal conditions and became nearly impossible in a blizzard. Halfway up the wall, her strength gave out completely. Her hands, already weakened by months of poor nutrition and recent childbirth, struggled to maintain their grip on the ice-slicked rope that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The combination of exhaustion, cold, and the awkward positioning required to protect Miguel finally overwhelmed her physical capabilities. Her hands slipped from the rope and she began to fall, Miguel's safety the only thing that mattered as gravity claimed them both in what seemed like slow motion. The ground rushed up toward them with terrifying speed, and Bee knew that impact would mean death for both mother and child. But Dakota was already moving, swinging down from above, with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his youth moving through mountain terrain that would terrify most adults. He caught them both in an embrace that nearly sent all three of them plummeting to their deaths, his arms wrapping around them with desperate strength, while his legs locked around the rope in a grip that their lives depended on. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite the strain of supporting two additional people while hanging from a rope in a blizzard that threatened to tear them all from their precarious perch. "Hold on to me and don't let go, no matter what happens." The moment stretched into eternity as they clung to each other on the face of the prison wall, with armed searchers below and 20 feet of treacherous descent ahead. Miguel chose that moment to cry out, his infant voice cutting through the night air like a knife and potentially revealing their position to every guard in the prison yard. "There!" Morrison's shout rang across the yard with the triumph of a hunter who had finally spotted his prey. "On the wall, all units converge. Open fire." Rifle shots cracked like thunder, bullets striking sparks from the granite around them as muzzle. Flashes lit up the night like deadly fireworks. The three fugitives completed their desperate climb, with lead flying around them, each second bringing them closer to either freedom or death. Sarah hauled them over the wall's crest with strength, born of pure determination and 18 months of planning for this exact moment. They tumbled together into the snow on the far side, gasping and shaking from cold, exhaustion, and the knowledge that their escape from the prison was only the beginning of a nightmare that would test every survival skill they possessed. But their escape from the stone walls was only the first challenge in a gauntlet that would push them to the very limits of human endurance. Beyond the wall lay 8 miles of mountain wilderness in the depths of winter, with armed pursuers behind them and the very real possibility of freezing to death before they could reach shelter that might not even exist. The snow on the far side of the wall was deeper than expected, reaching nearly to Bee's waist and making every step a struggle that sapped energy they couldn't afford to lose. The wind howled through the mountain passes with a fury that seemed personal, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. "The first cache is in Devil's Canyon," Dakota said as they stumbled through knee-deep snow, following game trails that were barely visible in the blizzard and represented their only hope of navigation in terrain that looked identical in every direction. "If we can reach it before dawn, we'll have food and warmer clothing to continue the journey." "How far?" Bea asked, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form words, while Miguel's small body pressed against her chest seemed to grow colder with each passing minute. 4 miles through terrain that would be challenging in summer daylight," Sarah replied grimly, looking back toward the prison walls, where torches were already appearing along the perimeter as guards organized a pursuit that would follow them relentlessly into the wilderness. In this weather with the baby, it might as well be 40. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder as Morrison organized a systematic search using techniques learned from decades of hunting both animals and humans through hostile territory. The lieutenant colonel had brought tracking dogs bred specifically for mountain work and men experienced in following trails through conditions that would stop most pursuers. The barking of the dogs carried clearly through the night air, a sound that spoke of professional hunters who would follow their quarry relentlessly until weather made tracking impossible or their target was dead. These weren't the farm dogs used by local sheriffs, but military animals trained to track escaped prisoners through terrain specifically chosen to discourage escape attempts. The first hour of their flight became a test of endurance that pushed all 3 adults to their physical and emotional limits, while baby Miguel remained their most vulnerable member. Bea stumbled repeatedly, her body still weak from childbirth, and her feet numb with cold inside boots that were never designed for mountain winter conditions that could cause frostbite within minutes of exposure. Each time she fell, disappearing into snowdrifts that seemed designed to swallow human beings, Dakota was there to help her up, his strength seemingly inexhaustible despite months of prison confinement that should have left him as weak as any other prisoner. His Apache heritage showed in his ability to read the terrain even in darkness, finding paths that avoided the worst of the snow accumulation. "We're leaving too clear a trail," Sarah observed during a brief rest behind a cluster of boulders that provided minimal protection from the elements, but gave them a moment to assess their situation. "The snow is so deep that our tracks will be visible for hours, maybe days if the weather doesn't change." "The dogs will follow our scent regardless of tracks," Dakota replied, studying the distant lights of the pursuit party through the falling snow. "But clear tracks will let them move faster and bring horses into terrain where they shouldn't be able to follow." Miguel remained miraculously quiet throughout the ordeal, as if he understood that their lives depended on silence in a way that transcended normal infant behavior. Bea had wrapped him inside her coat against her body, sharing her warmth with the newborn while trying to protect him from wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes and turn human breath into ice crystals. "We need to find shelter," Sarah said, her practical nature asserting itself despite the emotional strain of watching her brother and his companions struggle against conditions that killed experienced mountaineers. "The baby won't survive much more of this exposure, and neither will Bea. There's a cave system ahead," Dakota replied, consulting mental maps learned during his youth in these mountains when his grandfather had taught him to read terrain the way white men read books. "My grandfather used them during the Apache Wars. When soldiers were hunting our people through these same peaks, they're well hidden and go deep enough to escape the worst of the weather." But as they prepared to continue their desperate flight, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the canyon, multiplied and distorted by the rock walls until it seemed like an entire cavalry regiment was bearing down on them with the fury of military precision. Morrison had brought horses, which meant the fugitives' lead was evaporating with terrifying speed. "They're using the main trail," Dakota observed, studying the direction of the sounds with the acute hearing that had made him legendary as a scout. Faster than following our tracks through the snow, but it also means they have to guess which direction we've taken at each junction. Can we use that against them? Bea asked, shifting Miguel to a more comfortable position while trying to restore feeling to her frozen hands that had gone beyond pain into the numbness that preceded frostbite. Sarah's eyes lit up with an idea that was either brilliant strategy or elaborate suicide, her mind working with the tactical precision that had kept her alive during months of dangerous intelligence gathering inside the prison. We can create false trails leading in different directions, split their forces, make them waste time chasing shadows while we reach the cache. The plan required them to separate temporarily, with each person creating distinct tracks leading away from their actual destination toward points on the compass that would draw pursuit away from Devil's Canyon. It was incredibly dangerous. If any of them were caught alone, they would have no hope of survival against armed pursuers who had orders to shoot on sight. "I'll take the eastern trail toward the mining camps," Sarah volunteered, her voice carrying the calm determination of someone who had already accepted the possibility of death. "If Morrison's men follow me, I can lose them in the abandoned tunnels, where horses can't follow, and the echoes will confuse the dogs. And I'll create a trail heading north toward the trading post," Dakota added, pulling his sister aside for a conversation in rapid Apache that Bea couldn't understand but recognized as a farewell between siblings who might never see each other. Again, that leaves the southern route to Devil's Canyon clear for Bea and Miguel. "I can't make it alone with the baby," Bea protested, her voice breaking with exhaustion and fear that she was about to lose the only allies she had in a world that seemed determined to destroy her family. "If I get lost or collapse from exhaustion, we'll both die in this wilderness." "You won't be alone," Dakota said, pulling a small carved figure from his pocket, a bear carved from dark wood, worn smooth by generations of handling and representing spiritual protection that transcended physical reality. "This belonged to my grandfather, who survived 3 different cavalry pursuits through these mountains during the Apache Wars. It will guide you to safety." The charm felt warm in Bea's frozen hands, despite the bitter cold that had numbed every other sensation, and she realized it represented more than just direction-finding or spiritual comfort. Dakota was trusting her with a piece of his family's spiritual heritage, a bond that transcended their desperate circumstances and spoke of connections deeper than mere survival. They separated into the swirling snow with embraces that might be their final farewells, each taking a different path into the mountain wilderness that had claimed the lives of countless travelers over the decades. Bea found herself alone for the first time since her imprisonment, carrying her newborn son through terrain that had defeated experienced mountaineers and military expeditions. The southern trail proved to be a nightmare of hidden crevasses and unstable snow that could trigger avalanches with a single misstep, creating dangers that went far beyond the immediate threat of freezing to death. Bea's progress slowed to a crawl as she tested each step, using dead branches as probes to identify safe footing while fighting exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her judgment. Miguel remained quiet against her chest, but she could feel his body temperature dropping despite all her efforts to keep him warm through layers of cloth and the heat of her own body. The newborn's survival depended entirely on reaching shelter before hypothermia claimed them both, a race against time and weather that seemed increasingly hopeless. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew more distant as Morrison's forces split, up to follow the false trails that Sarah and Dakota had created, but ahead lay challenges that were potentially more deadly than armed men. This was a landscape that killed through indifference rather than malice, where a single mistake would leave mother and child as frozen monuments to failed escape. The carved bear seemed to pulse with warmth in her pocket, guiding her away from the most obvious paths toward routes that only someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain would know. She began to understand that Dakota's grandfather had faced similar desperate flights, had carried his own family through these same mountains while soldiers hunted them like animals across terrain that showed no mercy to the unprepared. As dawn approached, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances, Bee finally glimpsed the entrance to Devil's Canyon, a narrow cleft between towering rock walls that seemed to lead into the very heart of the mountain itself. But her relief was short-lived as a new sound reached her ears, the distinctive crack of rifle fire echoing from the direction Sarah had taken. The gunshots were followed by shouts and the barking of dogs, suggesting that at least one of their pursuers had found their quarry and engaged in combat that would determine whether their diversion had succeeded or failed. Whether Sarah had escaped or been captured remained unknown, but the sound of continuing gunfire suggested a running battle through the mountain wilderness. Bee pressed forward into Devil's Canyon, driven by the knowledge that Miguel's survival depended on reaching the Apache cache before hypothermia claimed them both in a death that would be slow and agonizing. The canyon walls rose like cathedral spires around her, blocking out most of the wind, but also trapping the cold in a funnel of ice and stone that seemed designed to preserve corpses for eternity. The cache, when she finally found it after an hour of searching that felt like days, was hidden beneath an overhang that required crawling through a gap barely wide enough for her shoulders. Inside, the space opened into a natural chamber that had been carved and enlarged by generations of Apache refugees seeking shelter from various enemies. Clay pots held dried meat and parched corn that had been stored against hard times, while bundles wrapped in oiled leather contained blankets and clothing designed for mountain survival by people who understood that the difference between life and death often came down to preparation and knowledge passed between generations. But as Bey fed Miguel and wrapped them both in the warmest covering she could find, grateful for the first real warmth they'd experienced since leaving the prison, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the canyon. Someone was coming, moving with the careful steps of a tracker, following a cold trail through terrain, where a single misstep could mean death. Whether it was Dakota returning as planned, or Morrison's men closing in for the kill, would determine whether their desperate flight ended in reunion or death, whether baby Miguel would grow up free or never grow up at all. The footsteps stopped, directly outside the cache entrance, followed by a low whistle that carried a melody Bee didn't recognize. It could be a signal from Dakota, using Apache communication methods she'd never learned, or it could be a trap designed to lure her into revealing her position to enemies who had tracked her through 8 miles of mountain wilderness. With Miguel's life hanging in the balance, she had to make a choice that could save them or doom them both. Beatriz Silva, a voice called softly through the gap, speaking with an accent that was neither Apache nor military, but carried the educated tones of Eastern speech mixed with frontier caution. "If you're in there, you need to come out now. We've got company coming up the canyon, and they're not the friendly kind." The voice belonged to neither Dakota nor Sarah, but to someone she'd never heard before, a man whose presence in this remote canyon at this specific moment could mean salvation or destruction. Whether he was an ally sent by Dr. Mackenzie or an enemy using psychology to flush her from hiding remained to be seen. The voice outside the Apache cache carried an authority that made Beatriz Silva's blood run cold, not because it sounded threatening, but because it sounded familiar in a way that her exhausted mind couldn't quite place. She pressed Miguel closer to her chest, feeling his tiny heartbeat against her ribs as she tried to decide whether to reveal herself or remain hidden in the ancient refuge that had sheltered Apache families for generations. "Mrs. Silva, I know. You're frightened, but my name is Samuel Harrison, and I'm the Territorial Circuit Judge. The voice continued, speaking with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being believed. Dr. Mackenzie sent me to find you before Morrison's men track you to this location. Judge Harrison, the man Dr. Mackenzie had mentioned as their only hope for justice in a territory corrupted by men who treated law as a commodity to be bought and sold. But how had he found her in this remote canyon? And why was he alone instead of traveling with the federal marshals who usually accompanied territorial officials through hostile terrain? Bay emerged from the cache slowly. Miguel clutched protectively against her chest to find herself facing a man in his 60s whose weathered features spoke of decades spent traveling frontier circuits where justice was often dispensed at gunpoint. Harrison stood well over 6 feet tall, with silver hair that caught the morning light and blue eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Behind him stood 2 other figures that made Bee's heart leap with relief and terror in equal measure. Dakota moved with the fluid grace of someone who had successfully evaded pursuit through 8 miles of mountain wilderness, but his clothes were torn and blood-stained from encounters that had clearly tested his survival skills to their limits. Beside him stood a woman Bee had never seen before, tall, blonde, and carrying herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. She wore frontier clothing that had been tailored for both function and authority, and her green eyes held intelligence that missed nothing about their desperate situation. "This is Marshal Catherine Sinclair," Judge Harrison explained, noting Bee's confusion about the stranger's identity. "She's been investigating corruption in territorial prisons for the past 6 months, and your escape has provided evidence we've been seeking for years." Marshal Sinclair stepped forward with movements that spoke of military training and years of law enforcement in territories where weakness meant death. "Mrs. Silva, I need you to know that your husband Carlos wasn't just a ranch hand. He was working undercover for the Territorial Marshal's office, investigating weapons smuggling that has destabilized this entire region." The revelation struck Bee like a physical blow, reshaping everything she thought she knew about her husband's death and her own imprisonment. Carlos had been a federal agent, which meant his murder hadn't been random violence, but an assassination, designed to silence someone who had uncovered systematic corruption. "He never told me," she whispered, feeling Miguel stir against her chest, as if sensing his mother's emotional turmoil. "He never said anything about government work or investigations, because it would have put you in danger," Dakota said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had spent months piecing together connections that painted a picture of betrayal, reaching the highest levels of territorial administration. "Carlos was protecting you by keeping you ignorant of his real mission." Judge Harrison produced a leather portfolio from beneath his coat, extracting documents that bore official seals and signatures that represented the full authority of territorial law. Dr. Mackenzie brought us Carlos's final report, hidden in his personal effects that were supposed to be destroyed after his death. "Your husband documented 12 separate incidents where Lieutenant Colonel Morrison orchestrated attacks on peaceful settlements. The documents told a story of systematic corruption that went far beyond simple weapons smuggling. Morrison had been creating Apache raids by selling guns to renegade bands, then using the resulting violence to justify military contracts that enriched him and his political allies, while innocent families paid the price in blood. The attack on your ranch wasn't random," Marshal Sinclair continued, her voice carrying the professional detachment of someone who had investigated too many crimes against innocent people. "Morrison's men came specifically to kill Carlos and retrieve any evidence he might have gathered. Your pregnancy made you a loose end they intended to eliminate along with your husband." Bee sank down onto a boulder, overwhelmed by revelations that transformed her understanding of the past 6 months. Her imprisonment hadn't been the result of frontier injustice, but a calculated effort to silence the widow of a federal agent who had died protecting settlements across 3 territories. The frame-up was Morrison's insurance policy, Judge Harrison explained, consulting additional documents that painted a comprehensive picture of conspiracy. If Carlos had shared information with you before his death, putting you in prison would discredit anything you might say while keeping you isolated from federal authorities who might investigate his claims. Miguel chose that moment to cry out, his infant voice echoing through the canyon like a declaration of life in a place where death had seemed inevitable. Bee automatically began to rock him, her maternal instincts operating independently of the shock that had numbed her conscience. Mind, what about Sarah? Dakota asked, his concern for his sister evident despite his attempts to maintain Apache stoicism. The gunfire we heard earlier came from her direction. Marshal Sinclair's expression darkened with news that none of them wanted to hear. She led Morrison's men into an ambush at the old mining camp, using the abandoned tunnels to turn their superior numbers against them. 3 soldiers died in the firefight, but Sarah was wounded and captured. The silence that followed was broken only by wind whistling through the canyon walls and Miguel's soft breathing as he settled back into sleep. Dakota's face remained impassive, but Bee could see the pain in his dark eyes as he processed the news of his sister's capture. Morrison has her, Judge Harrison continued grimly. He's using her as leverage to force you both to surrender. His message was simple. Turn yourselves in within 24 hours, or he executes her as an escaped prisoner who killed federal soldiers. It's a trap, Dakota said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who understood military thinking. Even if we surrender, he'll kill all 3 of us to eliminate witnesses. Sarah knows this. She made her choice to buy us time to escape. There's another option, Marshal Sinclair said, producing a map that showed the mountainous terrain surrounding Fort Carson Prison in detail that spoke of careful reconnaissance. Morrison is transporting Sarah to the territorial capital for what he's calling a military tribunal. The route takes them through Devil's Pass, where the road is narrow and surrounded by cliffs. Judge Harrison studied the map with the attention of someone calculating odds that involved life and death for multiple people. An ambush in Devil's Pass could work, but it would require precise timing and considerable firepower. Morrison will have at least 20 men guarding the transport. 20 men in a narrow canyon where they can't maneuver, Dakota observed, his tactical mind already working through possibilities that his Apache heritage had prepared him to understand. With the right positioning, a small force could create havoc among a larger group that relies on superior numbers rather than superior tactics. Bay looked down at Miguel, realizing that any rescue attempt would require her to make choices that could leave her son orphaned in a wilderness that showed no mercy to the helpless. But the thought of Sarah running bare, facing execution for helping them escape was unbearable. I can't fight, she said quietly. I have Miguel to protect, and I'm not a warrior like you two. But I won't run away while Sarah dies, because she helped us. You won't have to fight, Marshal Sinclair replied, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. But we need you alive to testify about Morrison's conspiracy when this reaches territorial court. Your testimony, combined with Carlos's documents and Dakota's evidence, will be enough to bring down the entire network, assuming we all survive the next 24 hours. Judge Harrison added, with the pragmatism of someone who had seen too many cases where justice died along with witnesses. The plan that emerged from their desperate conference was both audacious and dangerous, requiring coordination between federal authorities and Apache warriors, in terrain where a single mistake would mean death for everyone involved. But as morning light painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and red, it represented their only hope for saving Sarah and exposing corruption that had claimed too many innocent lives. The transport leaves Fort Carson at noon, Marshal Sinclair explained, consulting a pocket watch that had been a gift from her father when she'd first pinned on a federal badge. They'll reach Devil's Pass around 3 o'clock, which gives us 6 hours to get into position and prepare the ambush. What about reinforcements? Dakota asked. Morrison must have allies throughout the territorial government who will come to his aid if they learn what's happening. Judge Harrison's smile was grim as a winter storm. That's where federal authority comes into play. I've already sent word to the territorial governor that we're conducting an investigation into prison conditions. Any interference will be treated as obstruction of federal justice. But even as they planned their desperate gambit, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon like thunder before a storm. Someone was coming up the trail that led to the Apache cache, moving with the urgency of pursuit rather than the caution of exploration. "Hide," Marshal Sinclair commanded, drawing a revolver that gleamed with the deadly efficiency of well-maintained steel. "If it's Morrison's men, we fight. If it's more federal backup, we continue planning." The riders who emerged from the canyon's entrance numbered 6 men, all wearing the blue uniforms of territorial cavalry and carrying rifles that spoke of military precision. But their leader was a familiar figure whose presence changed everything about their situation. Dr. James Mackenzie rode at the head of the column, his medical bag secured behind his saddle and his weathered face showing relief at finding them. "Alive! Thank God you're safe," he called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying exhaustion from a hard ride through mountain terrain. Morrison discovered that I'd been in contact with Judge Harrison. He's declared martial law around Fort Carson and ordered all federal officials arrested as enemy agents. The implications of Morrison's desperate gambit were immediately clear to everyone present. By declaring martial law, the lieutenant colonel was essentially staging a military coup that placed him above territorial law and federal authority. It was the action of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from eliminating witnesses to his crimes. "How long before federal troops arrive?" Judge Harrison asked, already calculating how Morrison's declaration would affect their rescue plans. 3 days minimum, Dr. Mackenzie replied grimly. "The nearest federal garrison is in Denver, and they'll need time to organize a response that won't trigger a larger conflict with territorial forces." "Sarah doesn't have 3 days, Dakota said, his voice carrying the finality of someone who had already made his choice, regardless of consequences. "If Morrison is moving her today, we act today, with or without federal backup." Marshal Sinclair holstered her weapon and studied the men who had ridden with Dr. Mackenzie, noting that they wore badges, identifying them as territorial deputies rather than federal agents. "Who are these men? Can we trust them?" "Deputies who served with Carlos during his undercover work," Dr. Mackenzie explained. "They've been gathering evidence independently and waiting for someone with authority to act on what they've discovered." The senior deputy, a man named Thomas Brennan, whose Irish accent spoke of origins far from the Colorado Territory, stepped forward with documents that represented months of dangerous investigation. "We've been documenting Morrison's activities since before Carlos Silva's death. Between what we've gathered and what you've brought, we have enough evidence to hang him and a dozen of his co-conspirators. But evidence would be meaningless if Morrison succeeded in eliminating all witnesses before federal authority could be restored." The race against time had become even more desperate, with Sarah Runningbear's life hanging in the balance and the entire territorial justice system teetering on the edge of collapse. The ambush in Devil's Pass remains our best option, Judge Harrison decided after consulting with both Marshal Sinclair and the territorial deputies. But now we're not just rescuing Sarah, we're preventing Morrison from escaping to Mexico with enough stolen gold to buy his way into whatever army will have him. Stolen gold? B asked, shifting Miguel to a more comfortable position while trying to follow conversations that seemed to reveal new layers of corruption with each passing moment. Deputy Brennan produced a leather pouch containing nuggets that gleamed with the distinctive color of Colorado mountain gold. Morrison's been skimming from every military contract, every prisoner transport, every supply shipment that passed through his command. He's accumulated enough wealth to buy a small army, and he knows we're closing in. The revelation added urgency to their mission that went beyond personal loyalty or territorial justice. If Morrison escaped with his accumulated wealth, he could continue his criminal activities in Mexico or California, leaving a trail of corruption and violence across the entire American frontier. How many men can we count on for the ambush? Dakota asked, his tactical mind already working through scenarios that would require precise coordination between federal agents, territorial deputies, and Apache warriors. 12 deputies, 2 federal agents, and whatever Apache fighters you can summon on short notice, Marshal Sinclair replied, against 20 cavalry soldiers who are trained for exactly this kind of mountain warfare. Numbers aren't everything in terrain like Devil's Pass, Dakota observed, his voice carrying confidence born of generations of Apache tactical wisdom. My grandfather once held that same canyon against 50 cavalry troopers using nothing but rocks and determination. Judge Harrison consulted his pocket watch again, noting how quickly their planning time was disappearing. We have 4 hours to get into position and coordinate an attack that has to succeed on the first attempt. There won't be second chances if Morrison's transport gets through the pass. As the group prepared to leave the ancient Apache cache that had sheltered them through the crisis, Bee realized that she was about to become part of a battle that would determine not just Sarah's fate, but the future of justice in a territory where corruption had poisoned everything from local courts to military commands. Miguel stirred against her chest, his tiny fist waving as if he understood that his young life was about to be shaped by events beyond his comprehension. But as Bee looked into his dark eyes, so much like his father's, she felt a strength rising within her that had nothing to do with physical courage and everything to do with a mother's determination to create a world where her son could grow. Up free, I'm coming with you, she announced, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised everyone present, including herself. Absolutely not, Dakota replied immediately. Devil's Pass will be a battlefield, and Miguel needs his mother alive more than Sarah needs another fighter. Sarah risked everything to help us escape, Bee said, standing with Miguel clutched against her chest while meeting the eyes of every person present. She knew the dangers when she opened our cell doors, and she chose to help anyway. I won't abandon her now, and I won't raise my son to believe that loyalty means nothing when the cost gets too high. The silence that followed was broken only by wind whistling through the canyon and the distant sound of horses being prepared for a journey that would end in either victory or death for everyone involved. Devil's Pass carved through the Colorado. Mountains like a wound in the earth itself, its narrow walls rising 300 feet on either side to create a corridor where echoes lived longer than the men who made them. The ancient trail had witnessed centuries of violence, each leaving their mark in blood and bone, scattered across stones that remembered Apache war parties, Spanish conquistadors, and American cavalry. At precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, Marshal Catherine Sinclair crouched behind a boulder formation that provided perfect concealment, while offering clear sightlines down the pass toward the approaching cavalry transport. Through her field glasses, she could see Lieutenant Colonel Morrison riding at the head of 20 mounted soldiers, their blue uniforms stark against the snow-covered landscape. In the center of the formation rode a prison wagon, whose iron Bars contained Sarah running bare, her dark eyes scanning the canyon walls with the tactical awareness of someone who understood that rescue might come from any direction. Her wrists bore fresh shackles, but her spirit remained unbroken, despite facing execution for helping strangers escape. "Transport is 3 minutes out," Sinclair whispered into the speaking tube that connected her position to Judge Harrison's command post higher up the cliff face. "Morrison has positioned sharpshooters on both flanks, and the wagon is surrounded by a protective square." From his elevated position, Judge Harrison could see the entire battlefield spread out below like pieces on a chessboard where human lives served as pawns. His own life had been spent in courtrooms where words carried more weight than bullets, but today's justice would be dispensed at gunpoint. 300 yards down the pass, Beatrice Silva crouched in a natural alcove with baby Miguel pressed against her chest, her heart hammering with fear and determination. She had insisted on taking part in the rescue, despite every logical argument against placing a mother and newborn infant in the middle of a battlefield. Her role was both crucial and terrifying. When the shooting started, she would use Miguel's cries to create a distraction that might give Dakota the seconds he needed to reach the prison wagon. It required deliberately placing her son in danger, but the alternative was abandoning Sarah to certain execution. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the creak of leather and jangle of military equipment. Morrison had chosen his escort carefully. These weren't territorial militia, but career cavalry veterans who had fought Apache, Comanche, and Mexican irregulars across the frontier. "Remember the signal," Dakota's voice carried across the canyon through Apache bird calls. "When the eagle cries twice, we move as one. No hesitation, no mercy for men who profit from innocent blood." The Apache warrior had positioned himself on a narrow ledge that offered the best approach to the prison wagon, while providing cover from the rocks above. His grandfather's spirit seemed to guide his movements as he prepared for combat that would either free his sister or add his own body to the bones that littered this ancient killing ground. As the cavalry transport entered the narrowest section of Devil's Pass, Morrison raised his hand to halt the column, his experienced eyes scanning the canyon walls for signs of the ambush he knew was coming. 20 years of frontier warfare had taught him to read terrain like a book written in blood and stone. "Dismount and take cover," he ordered. "Sharpshooters to the high ground, prison detail to the center. If they want the Apache woman, they'll have to pay in blood." But Morrison's tactical adjustments came moments too late. Dakota's eagle cry split the mountain air, just as Miguel's infant wail echoed through the canyon, creating a symphony of sound that masked the movement of federal agents and territorial deputies as they emerged from concealment with rifles ready. The first shots came from Deputy Brennan's position on the south wall, his Irish marksmanship dropping 2 cavalry soldiers before they could reach cover. The gunfire triggered an avalanche of violence as both sides opened fire with desperate fury. Morrison's voice roared above the chaos as he tried to organize a defense against attackers who seemed to materialize from the canyon walls themselves. "Protect the wagon. Kill anyone who approaches the prisoner." But training for mountain warfare was different from actually fighting Apache warriors on terrain they had known since childhood. Dakota moved through the gunfire like a shadow given form, his body flowing from rock to rock while bullets sparked off granite inches from his position. Marshal Sinclair's revolver spoke with deadly precision, each shot carefully aimed to disable rather than kill whenever possible, but the cavalry soldiers showed no such restraint in their return fire. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but lasted only minutes, filling Devil's Pass with smoke and thunder. Through the chaos, Bea saw Dakota reach the prison wagon, just as Morrison himself emerged from cover with a drawn pistol aimed directly at Sarah's heart. The lieutenant colonel's face was twisted with rage and desperation as he realized that his criminal empire was crumbling around him. "One more step, and the Apache dies," Morrison shouted, pressing his gun barrel against Sarah's temple while using her body as a shield. "I'll put a bullet through her brain before I let federal authority destroy everything I've built." The standoff that followed lasted only seconds, but felt like an eternity. Dakota crouched behind the wagon's iron frame with a rifle aimed at Morrison's head, but the angle was impossible. Any shot that missed would kill his sister, and any shot that hit might trigger a reflexive pull of Morrison's trigger finger. It was B who broke the deadlock with an action that no one expected. Rising from her concealment with Miguel clutched against her chest, she walked directly into the line of fire between Morrison and Dakota, her voice carrying across the battlefield with clear authority. "Colonel Morrison," she called out, her words cutting through the gunfire like a blade. "My name is Beatrice Silva, and you murdered my husband Carlos for doing his duty as a federal agent. Look at me when I speak to you." Morrison's head turned toward her voice, his cold eyes taking in the sight of the woman whose testimony could destroy him and the infant who represented the next generation of witnesses to his crimes. In that moment of distraction, his pistol barrel moved just far enough away from Sarah's head to give Dakota the opening he needed. The Apache warrior's rifle cracked once, the bullet traveling less than 20 feet to find its target with precision that had made his people legendary. "Marksman?" Morrison staggered backward, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers as he collapsed against the canyon wall with blood spreading across his blue uniform. But even as Morrison fell, his dying words carried a chilling warning. "You think this ends with me? There are a dozen more like me scattered across this territory, and they'll hunt you all until the last witness is dead." The gunfire began to fade as Morrison's surviving soldiers realized their commander was down and their position was hopeless. One by one, they threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, understanding that continued resistance would only add their names to the casualty list. Marshal Sinclair moved quickly to secure the prisoners, while Judge Harrison descended from his command position to take formal custody of evidence that would reshape territorial justice. But it was Dakota who reached the prison wagon first, his hands working with desperate efficiency to free his sister. "You came for me," Sarah whispered as the shackles fell away from her wrists, her voice carrying wonder at finding herself alive when death had seemed certain. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Dakota replied, gathering his sister into an embrace that spoke of bonds deeper than blood and stronger than the forces that had tried to destroy their family. As the immediate chaos of battle gave way to the slower work of securing prisoners and treating wounded, Bea found herself standing in the center of Devil's Pass, with Miguel still clutched protectively against her chest. The infant had remained remarkably calm throughout the gunfire, as if he understood that his mother's courage had helped save lives. Dr. Mackenzie moved among the wounded with professional efficiency, treating injuries on both sides with impartial compassion. Even Morrison received medical attention, though his wounds were too severe for any treatment beyond making his final hours more comfortable. "The federal garrison from Denver will arrive tomorrow," Judge Harrison announced, consulting a telegram delivered by military courier. "They'll take custody of the prisoners and begin a full investigation into territorial corruption that reaches from local sheriffs to the governor's office." "What happens now?" Bea asked, looking around at the faces of people who had become family through shared danger and common purpose. "Where do we go from here?" Marshal Sinclair's answer came with federal authority and personal warmth. "You'll be under federal protection while you testify in the trials that will grow out of this investigation. Your testimony, combined with Carlos's documents and our evidence, will convict dozens of corrupt officials. And after the trials, Sarah asked, her dark eyes reflecting uncertainty as they contemplated futures that had been unimaginable only days before. Dakota answered with quiet wisdom, "After the trials, we build something better. We create the kind of world where children like Miguel can grow up without fear of corrupt lawmen who profit from other people's suffering." As evening shadows began to lengthen across Devil's Pass, painting the canyon walls in shades of purple and gold, the unlikely family forged in the fires of injustice began to plan for a future none had dared imagine. Bee would testify in territorial court, but she would also return to ranching with federal support to rebuild the life Morrison's conspiracy had destroyed. Sarah would use her knowledge of territorial corruption to work with federal investigators, helping to identify other cases where justice had been perverted by greed. Her months inside Fort Carson prison had given her insights into a network of abuse that extended far beyond a single corrupt warden. Dakota would serve as guide and translator for federal agents investigating Apache-related crimes, using his understanding of both cultures to prevent misunderstandings that had led to decades of unnecessary violence. His grandfather's spirit would finally rest, knowing his descendant was working to create peace, and Miguel Silva would grow up in a world where his father's sacrifice had meaning, where federal agents protected witnesses instead of local officials, silencing them, where justice was more than just a word used to justify powerful men's ambitions. As the last light faded from Devil's Pass and stars began to appear in the mountain sky, Bee felt a peace she hadn't experienced since Carlos's death. The road ahead would still be difficult, filled with trials that would force her to relive the worst moments of her life, but she would face those challenges with allies who had proven their loyalty. The baby in her arms stirred and opened, his dark eyes looking up at his mother with innocent trust. In those eyes, Bee saw not just her own reflection, but the reflection of everyone who had sacrificed to bring justice to the Colorado Territory. "Your father would be proud," she whispered to Miguel as the mountain wind carried away the smoke of battle. "He would be proud of all of us." The story that had begun with a woman giving birth in chains had ended with that same woman standing free in a mountain pass where justice had finally triumphed over corruption. It was proof that even in the darkest corners of the American frontier, hope could survive and freedom could be won by those brave enough to fight for it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.